Hey guys, today I'll be presenting some information about street widths and how they affect our cities. This information comes from an article in the Journal of the American Planning Association by Adam Millard Ball. To begin, let's go over what a right-of-way is. A right-of-way is defined as the legal right established by usage or grant to pass along a specific route through grounds or property belonging to others. In a transportation sense, it is the roads and walkways that connect our city together. Many times, a right-of-way is referred to simply as a street, but sometimes street can just refer to the roadway part of a right-of-way, ignoring the curb and sidewalks. In this presentation, I'll be using the term street to refer to the entire right-of-way for the sake of familiarity and brevity. So where do American street widths come from? The width of American streets, like many other developed countries, can trace its roots back to the Industrial Revolution, where massive urbanization along with leaps in technology created a fervent demand for upgraded transportation infrastructure. There was a sharp increase in average street widths in the late 1800s, coinciding with America's widespread urbanization at the turn of the 20th century. Street widths would diminish in the early 20th century, but would rise again after World War II during the post-war boom and the suburban sprawl of the 50s. So how wide are streets in America today? In America, the median residential street is 50.2 feet wide, and the average is 55 feet. This is enough for a two-lane road with on-street parking on both sides and pedestrian sidewalks. In comparison, other developed countries have built much smaller average street widths, with countries including France, Italy, South Korea, and Japan all building sub-20 feet average streets in recent years. 16 feet is generally considered the smallest a street can be made while allowing vehicular traffic to pass through safely, albeit at a lower speed. This kind of road would have no curb, and pedestrians and vehicles would share the same road. While it does seem to be counterintuitive to pedestrian safety, a smaller, desegregated road would force drivers to become more cognitive of pedestrians. An example of a street like this is in Shibuya City in Tokyo, Japan, which according to Millard Ball is about 13 to 16 feet wide. Japan's high-density cities and limited topography has resulted in the development of such streets, a callback to the pre-automotive age where streets were made for pedestrians. Pedestrians walk freely in the street, which is still large enough for a single vehicle to pass through at a time. By contrast, American streets are much bigger, partially because of the pervasive minimum parking requirements imposed upon property owners and developers. There are more factors that influence street widths that will be touched upon later in this presentation. As stated before, an average American residential street is around 55 feet wide, which constitutes usually of a curb sidewalk, parking lane, and a driving lane, which is then mirrored on the other side. Jones Street in New Brunswick represents this typical American street model perfectly, with the right-of-way width at approximately 55 feet according to Google Maps. When looking at two different street sizes side by side, the difference is quite jarring. An extremely efficient street, such as the one in Japan, is less than half the size of an average American street. A large, car-oriented street may facilitate better traffic flow, but often these large streets don't fit the needs of residential streets, which are usually quiet and see little vehicular traffic. In fact, these large roads mean smaller parcel and lot sizes, which means smaller, fewer, and more expensive housing units. Even if the 16-foot street is too claustrophobic for you, a half-sized American street at 27 feet can still easily accommodate a bidirectional lane, a parking lane, and sidewalks for pedestrians. In return, each property is now gaining 25% of the former street to its parcel, which can be a substantial amount of space. A 14-foot width increase can mean additional rooms, which could mean more housing units, which can bring down housing costs. There are some determining factors in why some street widths are more popular than others. Access value of streets looks at the street's ability to facilitate how many and how big of vehicles can access the property. Larger streets can obviously allow for larger vehicles, including public utility and emergency vehicles, but many residential areas don't need wide roads to allow for those vehicles when they need to access the street. Likewise, the movement value of larger streets allow for smoother flow of traffic. But most residential streets will have little to no thorough traffic, and thus do not need a very wide road for movement reasons. Storage value refers to the street value for parking, but large amounts of on-street parking devalues off-street parking, and reducing or removing on-street parking inherently generates more values to properties with off-street parking. Many other values, such as drainage, garbage collection areas, and open air access, don't bring enough benefit to warrant the large street sizes that exist now, when many other alternatives can bring similar benefits. The reasonings behind narrower streets reach into financial benefits as well. A good example of how smaller streets can benefit local homeowners is examining Santa Clara's street widths and how the street traps property value into it. Santa Clara County is a county in California that has residential streets worth $146,000 per unit, despite their streets already being narrower than the American average. Narrowing streets has the potential of releasing the trapped values from the streets and bring savings to the property owner. Narrowing to 46 feet can save $21,000 per unit, and a narrowing to the 16-foot minimum can save $101,000 per unit. These savings can be realized in a multitude of ways, including lower housing costs, windfalls to landowners, and allowing municipal governments to perform public benefit projects and programs such as parks. To wrap up, I'd like to address a few common concerns. How will emergency vehicles and public utility vehicles access narrower roads? As previously mentioned, larger streets would allow easier access for certain emergency response and public utility vehicles, but smaller streets don't necessarily mean they would become inaccessible. Certain countries, such as Japan, use smaller emergency vehicles to accommodate their smaller streets. Scaling utility vehicles to street sizes is more economical than scaling streets to large utility vehicle sizes. Wouldn't removing on-street parking cause a shortage in parking for communities? Outside of very densely populated areas, for example, New York City, on-street parking is not utilized enough to warrant all residential streets to be as wide as they are now to facilitate on-street parking. Eliminating parking on one side of the street while retaining parking on the other side can already save 6 to 8 feet of street space. The less dense an area is, the less on-street parking is valued. In fact, some suburban municipalities prohibit overnight parking on the street, since virtually all homes have driveways. Wouldn't a single, bidirectional lane be dangerous, since vehicles going opposite directions would have to share the same lane? The main reasoning behind bidirectional lanes in residential areas is that most residential streets will not be used for through traffic. That is, people will not drive through most residential areas to access a location other than the residential address on that street. The low amount of vehicular traffic means there will be a low likelihood of two vehicles driving on the road at the same time, and even less that they would be heading in opposite directions. In the event that two cars meet each other going different ways, the space dedicated to on-street parking would allow one car to move aside for the other. American streets are simply too big right now, spurred on by our car-centric ideals that prioritize our cities to the private automobile. This prioritization has led to ramifications in areas even outside of transportation, such as rising housing costs. Other countries with less developable space have pioneered compact, modern streets out of necessity, and it is time for the United States to adopt compact streets as well, before we find ourselves doing so out of necessity as well. I hope you've learned something from my presentation today, and thank you for listening.